Good morning, afternoon, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm Caroline McLaughlin and the Chief Partnerships Officer at ADPN. I'm delighted to have you with us, and first of all, wanted to encourage you to introduce yourself to the others in the room through the community chat box that you can see on the screen, and become connected virtually with other delegates who are signing in from across the world. You are joining us this evening for the last session on Climate Day, using collaboratives and networks to support climate solutions. This has truly been a fantastic day, hearing speakers explore the many different ways that we can all engage on climate action. I am also excited that the sessions today have embodied the vision of the ADPN's Climate Action Platform, which is to unlock capital in a more targeted and effective manner by engaging with climate leaders and potential investors to catalyze partnerships and collaborations to find new and impactful ways to move capital for climate solutions. As we are at the end of the third day of the ADPN conference, I know that many of you are familiar with ADPN, but for those joining for the first time, I did want to provide a quick overview of ADPN and the conference. Our mission is to move more capital towards impact in Asia. We are an ecosystem builder and a network of funders and resource providers with over 600 members across 32 markets, providing social investors like yourself with the opportunity to connect, learn, and lead. We have a few quick housekeeping announcements that will help you get the most out of this session. If you are finding that your webcam video is facing a lag, please pause the video by hovering over the image, such as my face, to reduce your internet bandwidth. The app version of Adobe Connect will offer you the best user experience. If at any point you get disconnected or have a bad connection, try to log out of the app and then log back in. Or if you're using the browser, refresh the page. There is a low-tech option available on Zoom, and that link can be accessed via the session page. If you are facing any other technical challenges, please do not hesitate to reach out to us through the Q&A pod or use the link provided to reach the ADPN help desk. Please note that this session will be recorded and you will be able to access the recording from conference.adpn.asia. We want to make this session as interactive as possible, so there will be polls and we will be holding a Q&A at the end of the session. So please type your questions into the Q&A pod, although due to time constraints, the speakers may not be able to respond to all of the questions. We are sharing highlights of our day live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, so don't forget to share your experience with us by using the hashtag ADPN2020. And finally, at the bottom of the screen, we have also provided you with reading materials that you can download or refer to. For those delegates with full access, please continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates in this session through the ADPN connector. That link may be found in the resource section below. Before we move on to the session, I have a very special video to share. Ashnila Onina is a 12 years old river warrior, a student of 12 Gresik Middle School from Bangung village in Indonesia. At a very young age, she has become an advocate for environmental sustainability, focusing on foreign plastic waste imported from countries including the US, Canada, the UK, Italy, and Australia, that is ending up as rubbish in her village in Indonesia. Her aim is to encourage world leaders to have their own efficient waste collection systems and to demand that the government of those exporting countries clean up the piles of plastic scraps that are being dumped in her neighborhood, the Bangun village. The world leaders that Nina has already addressed about this imported waste issue include Angela Merkel, Scott Morrison, Justin Trudeau, and Donald Trump. I am honored to be able to share this video of Nina Aquila, Asia's very own Greta Thunberg, today.
The main environmental problems occur in my area are imported plastic waste dumping near paper mills, river pollution, industrial waste dumping, burning trash, smoke from factories polluting the air, pollution of plastic waste in rivers and beaches. Plastic waste was smuggled in waste paper bales that was imported by paper mills in East Java. Imports to East Java was increased by 35% in 2018 compared to 2017. That brought a lot more foreign plastic packaging waste dumped in Bangun village. About 30% of plastic scraps for paper mills has low value, that it is being burned in the dump sites or sold as cheap fuel for tofu factories in Sidoarjo. Paper mills and plastic recycling factories also release microplastic into rivers that could contaminate drinking water supplies, fish and crop consumed by people in Brantas River. Indonesian government do not prioritize environmental protection because, first, the pollution effects are long-term effects and not directly impact wider community or official government. Second, Indonesia is a developing country that we are focused on developing economy and building infrastructure. Too little money available for waste management or environmental pollution control. Third, environmental protection cost is usually seen as burden to economy that will slow down economic development. Many Indonesian people do not know about hazard of plastic. I want to share my knowledge to other schools about the dangers of microplastics. 80% fish sampled in Brantas River contain microplastics in their stomach. If people consume fish and water that are contaminated with microplastic, then microplastic will also accumulate in our body that will cause health disorder to us. I want the leaders of developed countries to stop exporting plastic waste to Indonesia because your waste are not being recycled in a safe way here. I demand Indonesian government to stop importing mixed paper waste for paper mills. I want Brantas River to be clean, healthy, and beautiful again so I can play, swimming, fishing with my friends like my parents did 35 years ago. Thank you so much for listening my story, and together we can save the environment from plastic disaster.
Thank you. That was truly inspiring, and we hope to have Nina at the conference next year live. It's also a reminder as to why collaboratives and networks are needed to find solutions for climate action. With that, I now welcome today's moderator, Stephanie Arrowsmith, Network Development Lead at Second Muse, to start the session.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for that introduction and for sharing Nina's story. That's really inspiring. I'd like to welcome everyone here joining us today for this exciting session. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. We have a powerful women-led panel here today representing all sectors and a diversity that we like to see when we talk about network-centered collaboration and when we talk about networks to support climate solutions. So before we jump into individual introductions, I do want to share a little bit of framing on why this topic is so important. The issue of climate is so complex that there will be no single organization or actor solving it alone, nor will there be one resource required to support these types of solutions. Taking a network-centered approach and using networks to support climate solutions fundamentally allows us to leverage whole system development in a way that can be more inclusive. And it was really exciting having a chat to our panelists last week before this session, and this was a really strong belief that came through in everyone's work. So I'm very excited to share with you how different organizations in different countries are approaching this, and how multi-sector approaches can help us accelerate the solutions that we want to see in climate. So before we jump into the next session, okay, so just to give you a bit of framing on why we're so excited to share from our side at Second Muse. Second Muse is an organization that looks at network-centered incubation and acceleration. We've been, similar to Nina, we've been very passionate about the issue of ocean plastic pollution and waste management, and trying to understand how we can build a network to help accelerate more efforts in this area, looking at financial, social, and technical resources to bring together and sustain change, primarily in South and Southeast Asia. So that's one of the reasons why we are here and why we're so proud to be moderating this panel and sharing some perspectives on this issue within climate. So we have a quick poll that we'd love to share with you all, just to do a bit of a pulse check and see who is in the room. So as you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a poll there. I can see already a couple of people selecting their answer, but we'd love to hear from you. Are you currently part of a collaborative or a network that aims to accelerate climate action? And if you are, which networks are you part of? This will help us give a sense of where everyone is at the moment, which networks you had interacted with. Throughout the session, we hope to highlight some of the networks providing a platform for organizations like yourself to join if you're not already part of a network towards climate action, and also share some of the reasons and some of the ways you can get the most out of networks. So I can see a lot of answers, of course, AVPN and the AVPN Climate Action Platform. Fantastic. Global Connect, Circular Cities Asia. Wonderful, wonderful. A lot of responses coming in here. Andy, India Collaborative Collaboration, fantastic. So we've got quite a spread in the room, actually. We've got, around 36% of us are part of a network. We have about 35 who are not yet, and about 30% thinking about joining one. So we hope that by the end of the session, you are inspired and motivated to see how you might play a role in a network. And next, I would like to introduce you to some of our speakers who are going to be sharing the networks that they're part of and some examples of collaborative and partnership-based approaches to climate action. So on our panel today, we have Nancy Smith, Director of the Climate Action Pledge, Marika Lindstrom, VP of Packaging and Procurement at Unilever, and Shloka Nath, the Executive Director of India Climate Collaborative. These three women will share very different perspectives on how they are looking at collaboration and using networks to support the area of climate. So I think we're gonna kick off with Nancy first to give a short introduction about her work at the Climate Action Pledge.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I also want to thank Ashnina for the video that was shared. I think none of us can walk away not being fully inspired by what the rising generations are already doing. And I think there's much more to come. So very, very encouraging to see the video. So thanks for that. I also want to thank AVPN for the opportunity to be here today. As Stephanie introduced, I'm the director for the Climate Action Pledge, which is an initiative of Global Friends Philanthropy and the Sea Foundation. And the initiative is really committed to expanding and deepening climate philanthropy. And today is our first sort of public launch of the Climate Pledge. So I'm really excited to share that. We may, if we're lucky, get a slide coming up shortly, but if not, no worries. There's some material that'll be disseminated at the end of the session today. So we will direct you to the Climate Pledge website that way.
But the pledge is really designed to help to trigger an additional US $1 billion in philanthropic funds for climate change. Those funds can be in the form of gifts, grants, and or investments. The platform is online, as mentioned. It is open to everyone. Anyone can use it. We will begin tracking commitments, though, of 100,000 US equivalent and upwards. We've created a partnership with Candid, which some of you may know under its former name of the Foundation Center, to help to track and analyze the data. I think probably most of us are aware that climate philanthropy is still a growing, needs to grow a little more and faster, but a growing field. And tracking this data and analyzing where funds are going, I think will be really helpful for us to understand where gaps persist, but also to show and demonstrate what our field is capable of, what this sector is capable of doing and bringing to the field to create change. So that's an important element for us. We also have created a directory of opportunities. We've been active in the field for a couple of years and have heard multiple times that some foundations, some philanthropists, individuals have perceived barriers to participation in climate philanthropy. And many of those we heard over and over again rest around lack of capacity, lack of knowledge, and or a feeling that the scale of the problem is so vast that relatively modest means that some of these offices or foundations have to dispose would not have a serious impact. So our Directory of Opportunities has been pulled together specifically to showcase where relatively modest amounts, say approximately 100,000 US dollars equivalent, could really have demonstrable impact. It was important for us for everyone to feel that climate action, climate philanthropy should be actionable, it should be tangible, and it should be accessible to everyone. This really is an issue that all of us need to be grappling with. So we have decided to highlight a few areas in the directory that we think are important for the philanthropic sector to be paying attention to. Those include food and food systems, climate literacy, climate communications, working with cities as a locus of action, and also investment. And the investment space, I think it's we're part of the reason we're so excited to be part of the AVPN is this sort of bridging across between traditional philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, impact investing, corporate investing. So the investment side is another one that we are highlighting. That being said, the pledge itself is completely agnostic, if I can use that word. So long as the funds that you are committing are focused on climate change, we are happy to track that information. I should also clarify that we are not collecting the funds. We want all of you to be stepping up, thinking about where you could be directing more of your resources, and then tell us what you're doing. Tell us what you're committed to doing, and we'll collect that information and pull it together. So in short, really the pledge is about a call to action, a way to push climate change farther up the philanthropic agenda. We think that climate change really needs to be part of our daily discourse, our thoughts, our actions. And I want to just end by referencing something that Nina said on the opening day. She talks about our collective humanity. And in our perspective, climate change really is a civilizational challenge. And as such, it demands a collective response. And so we're very excited to be launching the Climate Pledge here today. And we hope that all of you will have a chance to go to the Climate Pledge website, tell us how you plan to step up to do more for climate philanthropy in the coming year. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. And next we have Marika. We'll be sharing her introduction.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you, AVPN, for having me. So just a few quick words about Unilever. So Unilever is a $52 billion euro global company focusing on fast-moving consumer goods. And here you can see our sales are spread all around the world, but still our majority of the business is coming from developing and emerging countries. Here are a couple of our brands that I'm sure many of you are familiar with: Magnum, Omo, Dove, Sunsilk, Lux, Rexona, and Knorr. And as all these are packaged goods, it of course presents some environment and climate related challenges. Exactly 10 years ago, Unilever launched a Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which is a threefold program. First of all, improving health and well-being for more than 1 billion people through health and hygiene and nutrition, reducing the environmental footprint by half around water, waste, sustainable sourcing, and greenhouse emissions. And last but not least, enhancing livelihoods for millions of people through equal opportunity for women, inclusion in the workplace, health and safety in the workplace. And what I want to mention today especially are our commitments and our collaborations and networks around waste, and specifically plastic waste. Back in 2017, we made 2 commitments around plastic waste for 2025. First of all, 25% PCR inclusion in all our plastic packaging. And secondly, making all our plastic packaging 100% recyclable or compostable or biodegradable. We started another review last year, and we felt that these commitments are not big enough and broad enough to really address plastic waste, especially in South Asia, Southeast Asia, in developing countries. And we introduced 2 additional plastic goals in October last year. First one being collecting and processing more plastic waste than what we sell, which is a huge, giant leap for us in terms of our commitments. And secondly, reducing virgin plastic by 50% and reducing overall plastic footprint of ours by 100,000 tons. And these 2 new goals are definitely areas where we need a lot of collaboration with technology providers, our peer companies, NGOs, local waste pickers, and so forth. And I'm looking forward to discussing that further in the panel discussion and in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika. And next we have Shloka from the India Climate Collaborative.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm just waiting for my slides to load up, but I can start. My father has often said that if I want to build a ship, I should bring people together not to hunt for wood or to construct the craft, but to teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. For purposeful change, you require a shared vision and goal, and you have to ensure you bring everyone on board and that they're all gazing outward in the same direction. And that was really the task before us in building the India Climate Collaborative. So who are we? Over 10 of the country's foremost philanthropies have come together to found the India Climate Collaborative. We're the first ever collective response by industry leaders for effective action towards a shared climate goal. And we stretch beyond philanthropy, mandated to amplify and spread local solutions. We're a coordinated ecosystem of Indian donors, implementers, government representatives, businesses, academia, civil society, and communities who will work together with support from the international climate community. So the ICC really seeks to drive collective investment and connect diverse voices, and in doing so, craft a uniquely Indian response to climate change, one that is attuned to our needs and development priorities. And the ICC is really unique and important, not because it is championing one solution or one approach. It exemplifies what we know, which is no one is protected and everyone has a responsibility. So an initiative like ours is really important, not only because it takes a stand on a highly complex issue like climate change, but because it is also a powerful instance of true collaboration in the Indian philanthropic sector. So as you can see, our vision and our mission is very aligned to building in a story around climate change within India that empowers institutions, individuals, and communities to really rise to India's climate challenge. We seek to help both people and nature thrive together. Our goals are bracketed across 3 different verticals. We've called them Inspire, Connect, and Empower. The Inspire piece is what I was just referring to, which is really building the Indian climate change narrative, one that is driven around India's economic transition, one that is driven around India's development goals and priorities, and it's focused on a human impact story around climate change. Connect, of course, is the fact that the collaborative will really seek to connect a whole ecosystem of diverse actors, whether it's government or philanthropy or businesses, to come together, as well as civil society, to work on climate change. Right now, one of the biggest challenges in climate change in India isn't necessarily that the solutions don't exist. It's more that everyone is working in silos. And so how do we create an institution that would really bridge that ecosystem and connect these diverse set of actors? And finally, Empower is the capacity building arm. So that's really where we seek to build technical knowledge and expertise, as well as mobilize resources for actors within the climate ecosystem in India, and also how we seek to build in the gaps around the climate change ecosystem. So it's really a dual mandate. Not only are we seeking to sort of build in the gaps, as I said, in the wider ecosystem around climate change, but we're really hoping to also scale solution providers so that they are better equipped to deal with the impacts of climate change as they currently exist. And we launched this year in January 2020. I'm happy to say that we had a really stellar response to the India Climate Collaborative. We were featured across a number of reports. And we've now got over 20 leading domestic and international philanthropies who are core founders, as well as over 50 plus partners within the Indian ecosystem, as well as internationally. So I'll pause here and hand it back to Stephanie.
Thank you, Shloka. Wonderful. So we're going to be transitioning into the panel discussion portion of this session. And I'd like to encourage you all, I'm sure through the introductions you might have some questions. So I would like to encourage you all to also think of some of the questions you'd like to ask the panel. After this, we will have a Q&A and be able to highlight some of those. So thank you all for your introductions. I think it really showcases the diversity of these different approaches to collective action towards the same issue. And I think it gives our viewers a bit of that representation across sectors. I did want to ask you, Nancy, I guess representing the philanthropic sector globally, what are some of the efficiencies that you can gain by taking a network-centered approach or by taking a collaborative approach to climate action? And how have you seen that play out in the philanthropic sector?
Well, I think one of the things that we find really vital in terms of understanding what is happening is to do a little bit better sharing of information so that there is a better sense of where are there some gaps, what are some ways that the philanthropic actors can help create more robust ecosystems, whether that's the climate financial ecosystem, let's say, through impact investing, through their own commercial investing, what have you, but also through grant making. I mean, there's a lot of space where from the still incomplete data that is available to us that we see where our sector maybe isn't as actively involved as it could be to help create greater change, deeper change. Another area that I think where we've started to see so I'll give 2 examples. One is around food and food systems. And in the last couple of years, both I think not even preceding the IPCC report on land and agricultural systems, we already saw a number of foundations, grant makers coming together that have been active both in food and some that have been active in climate to better understand how to pair up these conversations and how to deepen the impact that they're having in both areas by working together more collaboratively. Another, which I think is still perhaps a bit more nascent, is in narrative building. It's a really important aspect where I think philanthropy has a very particular role that it can play there in building narratives, in sharing new narratives. How do we make a pull, not just a push, related to climate change? Right? We want to create a vision of something, a future that we all want to be a part of. Shloka mentioned this is something that impacts all of us. It doesn't impact all of us equally, but it impacts all of us, and it is only going to be getting worse. And so there is a fear, there is sort of this emergency notion. That's important to get our attention, but it may not be enough to sort of drive us to action, to sustained action. And so I think it's really exciting to see the philanthropic sector stepping in more on narrative building to create the future. We all can be creating this future together that we want to be moving towards. And so we want to make it more hopeful, more optimistic, the better instead of what we need to just move away from. So those are two areas that I think there's been some exciting movement in recent times.
Thanks so much, Nancy. And something I was hearing from all of your sharing as well was the role of signaling that can be played by networks. There's a strength in taking a collective approach to signaling priorities, and particularly, for example, in Unilever, taking that corporate responsibility and signaling as well within your sector of the importance and the commitments that you're making. This can also influence the ecosystems around us. So I think that's a really important point. And Shloka, I wanted to zoom in a little bit. I think the ICC sits in a very particular context in terms of philanthropy and network building. It's really looking at a developing country and how to mobilize resources and learning and philanthropic efforts within that context. We know that network building is not a passive activity. It's actually very time-intensive, relationally intensive, and sometimes it requires more than just connecting, right? It actually requires deeper capacity building, for example. So I'd love for you to share maybe some of your experiences of what you've learned is necessary to sustain a very healthy network or collective.
Well, my grandmother has this saying, and she says that if two people agree on everything, then one of them is unnecessary. And it keeps coming to mind when I think about sort of building a collaborative, is that you need to sort of, do away with the need to really sort of aim for consensus, because that just isn't really the outcome that you should be looking for, or necessarily the one that's going to actually achieve the best results. I think what we've learned via building a collaborative is you want to be able to sort of meet everyone where they're at, and yet help them aspire to the greatest level of ambition. So what is that journey that you're identifying for them? How do you create a common baseline of understanding, a common taxonomy between all of the members of a collaborative, so that when I say climate change and you say climate change, we're referring to the same thing? And then can we have agreement upon that, even if there are different methodologies that we may employ to sort of achieve the targets or the goals that we want to aim towards. I think in our case, given that the collaborative was very sort of India focused and defined around not only helping India meet its own targets, but how does that, and Nancy pointed this out, how does that tie into the larger global narrative? What is that piece around the story that the global South is building out that is so different from the global North? And how do we really, take a leadership position around defining that story, so that, when we talk about it, not only do we understand what it means on a visceral level for ourselves, but really we're able to sort of communicate those missing pieces in that larger narrative, and hopefully, move everyone together, even if it's at a different pace or in a different way. So that's really, I think, something that stands out for me when it comes to the importance of building networks. It's not just about getting everyone in the same room. It's really making sure that they are very clearly attuned to why they're there, that they hear and see themselves reflected in that journey. And they all know that larger purpose that they're moving towards, even if we all have a different, sort of route to get there.
Absolutely. And I really like that example you drew around narrative building at a country level and how that can also influence that the power of narrative building globally as well. And I think it's a really interesting, it allows us to amplify the efforts of what we see locally on the ground, but also work more effectively in terms of movements globally, if we're able to aggregate this way. Thank you for sharing. And Marika, it was really inspiring to hear such ambitious targets and really important targets for a company like Unilever to make, particularly around plastic waste reduction. I know that that's been further reinforced as a partner of the Circulate Capital Ocean Fund and the commitments that Unilever has made there. I'd love to hear some maybe inspiring examples on the ground of how you've seen some of these collaborations play out with Unilever, perhaps with other multi-sector partners, in order to achieve these ambitious targets.
Good, thank you. Since we're such a large company, what is very important for us to develop is scale, industrial scale. For us, waste collection and processing is really an industrial activity. It needs to be, and we definitely need partners in helping build that scale. And once you also build scale, you can create more win-win solutions within the whole ecosystem and help social impact in the countries in a much larger scale. Working with Circular Capital has helped us really channel some funds for smaller companies who want to develop themselves as part of the ecosystem, especially around waste processing, because our goal being both collecting and processing plastic waste, it's not good enough if we manage to build the ecosystem for waste collection. We need to find better and better ways of processing the waste as well. It may start with something like burning the waste, which is not necessarily the best solution, to mechanical recycling and eventually potentially chemical recycling. And these smaller scale mechanical recycling companies are starting to emerge in countries like India, Indonesia, and Philippines. And every time we hear about a startup or an entrepreneur who wants to start developing these processing technologies, we ask the Circular Capital to do a little bit of due diligence on our behalf and the other investors' behalf to help get these startups going and contribute to the larger ecosystem.
Thank you, Marika. And I'd love to, before we jump into the Q&A part, I'd love to extend that question also to Nancy and Shloka. From your initiatives and your collaboratives, do you also have some examples of how do these interesting partnerships or outcomes play out that are possible only through this approach of taking a partnership-centered approach?
Nancy, do you want to go first?
Okay, sorry, I was waiting on you. We're all so polite. Well, I think there's no question that we need to be working in concert with one another. And I think that there's a lot that depends. I'm going to state the obvious, right? There's a huge continuum of what constitutes partnerships, collaborations, being in alliances, being in networks, et cetera. And I think that there's some things that require very deep partnership in order to have the kind of impact that you want to reach. There are others where, I think you used the word signaling, Stephanie, that is also extremely powerful, but maybe requires less sort of deeper partnership to do that. Those are the networks, the collaborations, other alliances. But I do think we've seen, there's so many good examples where bringing funding together can be an extremely powerful way for the philanthropic sector to leverage impact. But beyond that, I also think there's a lot to be done with just providing leadership, the voice of the sector is extremely powerful. And I'm not sure that that's a power that we recognize as much as maybe we should or could. And I would love to see, particularly in the climate space, the sector coming together and using its voice to sort of say, this is on our agenda, this needs to be on the agenda for all of us. and to start to really push forward on creating that kind of deeper change. So maybe that's a little bit general, but I think there's so many great specific examples that I don't want to sort of start listing. But Shloka would love to hear maybe there's something specific through the ICC.
Thanks for that, Nancy. You put it beautifully, and so did Marika. So I think just to answer that question, I may have to go back a little bit into, why we decided to build the ICC again. And at the moment, climate-focused philanthropic funding in India remains low, less than 10% of the total philanthropic funding, and it's concentrated in sectors like agriculture, energy, environment. And this is because despite the opportunity, philanthropies face a set of challenges that they require assistance with, whether it's technical knowledge in how to connect climate change action to philanthropic activities. So how do you apply that climate lens across your portfolio of work? To the absence, of course, of a collective climate strategy to establish best practices and programs, none of this exists in India right now. There's also a low level of awareness. So some foundations know about the unintended impacts of their programs on climate change, but not much action is being taken to address it. Equally important, foundations lack the capacity to measure the impact of their own programs in contributing towards climate change, nor are they able to assess the potential effects of climate change on their current portfolios. So what is the value of collaboration? It makes sense to therefore de-risk investments by ensuring the collective will to act and to coordinate a wide range of actors to exchange ideas, information, as well as best practices. Collaboration is also key to collectively identifying priority research and knowledge needs. It helps you frame a long-term agenda for tackling climate change. We also avoid duplication in research and can align financial investments towards outcomes that are really innovative and necessary, even if risky. And collaboration also means that you have opportunities for co-investing in institutional capacity, in other words. So how can we drive our capital to build a climate change ecosystem in India? And I would also say, to Nancy's point, collaboration can amplify existing voices and can develop future leaders to tell the story of India through the lens of Indian institutions, individuals, and communities. In India, we're still writing our development story. It's a narrative that weaves human and ecosystem development work together to combat climate change, and it's what's going to make a resilient and future-ready India, as well as, of course, the fact that our story is very unique. The solutions that exist overseas are not going to be as effective as in India as Indian solutions. So our scientists, innovators, educators, we're all engaged in India-specific work. But all of these efforts, whether they're technology solutions or social enterprises or even research, they're all disaggregated, and they need to be integrated and shared more widely and effectively. And that is really where philanthropic funding has a key role to play.
Thank you so much, Shloka. That really helped to paint a picture of the why and that often that interesting question of what is the value of collaboration? There are both tangible and intangible parts of that answer. And I know I wanted to also just spotlight very quickly, but AVPN Constellations also showcases some of these very tangible partnerships that have led to really interesting and unique outcomes. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at that. But it's great. It's a great way to highlight before we move into the next section of this panel. And I think one reflection we had as a group before coming into this space was also looking at the current context we're in terms of COVID and the pandemic. I think if there's anything that this current situation has shown us is that collective action is possible. And it's the coordination of that collective action, which is where networks and these collaboratives come in. Because we all know as long as that narrative is built well, the intent is there. It's absolutely possible to shift and create change in a short period of time. So I'm seeing already some questions roll in for the panelists here. So I do want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So I think we're going to switch over to the question and answer portion. Okay. So let me read through some of these. I think one of the questions here we haven't addressed so far in our discussion, and I think this question could go to anyone. So feel free to just jump in there. Don't be shy. In terms of climate solutions, for example, recycling plastic waste, policy and regulation plays a very critical role. How do collaboratives and networks facilitate change in policy and legislations, or what role should they and can they play in shaping policy?
I'll jump in just quickly because I think one of the things that's very clear is there needs to be a stronger demand for change. And so I think through collaborations and networks, we can stoke the demand side for those kinds of policies, right? I mean, sometimes the policy leads, but quite often one of the things we've heard specific to climate policy, climate action, is that there has been a lot of very good policy guidelines written, but until the demand comes from sort of the citizen side, the consumer side, there's not going to be very much action. So we need to demand that from our policymakers to give us better policies, better frameworks to guide action and to guide the action of other actors.
Yeah, and just to add to what Nancy just said, I would also say, you know, and this is a problem that's not unique to India. It's true for most countries across the world. Is a lot of information is sitting in research institutions and in academia, but it's sitting in silos. It's not being translated for policymakers. And so what happens is when trying to deal with these incredibly complex and systemic challenges, you know, very often a bureaucrat will have like 15 different research proposals on his desk, you know, and there's no sort of explanation or real understanding of how that might be applied in real life, which, you know, what to choose and how to move forward. And I think that's really, again, where a collaborative could play a very strong role in building out a set of best practices, highlighting possible solutions, as well as making sure, most importantly, that it's being translated so it's actually put into use.
Thanks so much. And Marika, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think these collaboratives and foundations can certainly try to drive the right type of legislation, because it can be either top-down as an extended producer's responsibility, plastic taxes, things like that, or enabling the development of infrastructure in countries through legislation, which is naturally very helpful in building these type of networks. So the approach can be either top-down or bottom-up, but with the collective power of a collaborative and a foundation, of course, it's more meaningful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think in our experience at SecMuse, working in a collaborative or network gives you more power in a way to be able to influence policy and can provide a representative voice that actually can help policymakers make more informed decisions as well. So I think there's definitely a role to play there, and there's more to be explored in that space around policy innovation. And I really like this question that's come through as well, because I think it really points to the truth that, you know, collaboration is not easy at all. And so this question really speaks to, what are the typical barriers to collaboration? What are some of the barriers that maybe you've experienced in collaboration, and what sets us up well for this? How do we prepare well as individuals and organizations to collaborate, particularly across sectors? Feel free to jump in, because I feel like it could be applicable for any of you.
Maybe I start.
Marika,
I think on a sorry, apologies. So I think on a corporate side, you need to be able to create the win-win solutions. So, for instance, going back again to plastic waste collection, different kinds of plastics are important to different companies. And through that, you can create win-win solutions. Of course, you need to also be like-minded in terms of your sustainability and your environmental goals. Plus, the corporate culture needs to be open enough to collaborate as a whole. So I think there's a cultural element, there's a willingness, and there's mutual goals and mutual benefits that have to align.
Yeah, absolutely. So really understanding what the needs are on both sides and really designing that partnership with that in mind, which sometimes we don't understand exactly what those needs are, and so that requires a little bit more time to tease out and build a relationship around. And Shloka, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, I was just gonna. I think Marika pointed out sort of the most important one, which is you have to make sure that you don't have misaligned objectives. You need to sort of have a really clear and robust shared commitment across all of the different members of the collaborative. I would also say I think some of the other things that we have definitely come across and sort of learned by experience is collaborative efforts could get siloed because if you don't have sort of a systems-based approach and if you aren't looking at it from a societal challenge, then eventually you'll end up only sort of dealing with one piece of the problem, and that could be the downfall of a collaborative. A couple of other things are, you have to make sure that the collaborative doesn't sort of have to, there's no competition, amongst personal agendas and certain actors holding control. It has to be sort of a democratized, a power structure or management structure within a collaborative. And of course, you have to ensure that there's a high degree of engagement. I think one of the sort of pitfalls of collaborative or barriers to a successful collaborative is when there's low engagement, when there's a lack of understanding of what you gain from collaboration, and that could cause a lot of disagreement as well.
Thank you for sharing.
Can I just jump onto Shloka's last point, which I think is then, the leadership aspect of it, so that any institution, any organization, that you need to have the leadership clearly on board and signaling that then across the institution, so you don't end up with somebody sort of mid-level trying to maintain a deep partnership with another organization or foundation. I think clear and shared expectations was mentioned. But another one that occurs to me is also the ability to maybe check egos a little bit. A lot of institutions want to use opportunities for branding, opportunities to sort of demonstrate that their own leadership around a particular issue or in a particular field, and sometimes that can become its own barrier. And so how do you create something where, as Marika said, it's a win-win, and that's not just at a a financial level, but sort of the branding, the ability to have that impact, so that everybody can sort of own that together and benefit from it as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Collaboration by definition requires you to check that ego at the door in order to show up really ready to look at the problem together, and to look at how to solve it without making any assumptions of what role you might be playing. So I think that's a really important reminder. We do have a couple more questions coming through. So we have a specific question for you, Shloka. You mentioned that the ICC is building solutions specific to India. We're curious to hear how the response to climate change is different in India. Could you elaborate? And perhaps also on the way you developed your approach. How was it designed and which stakeholders were involved?
Sure. That's a bunch of different questions in one. I'll try and it's a long question. I'll try and be as succinct as possible. Climate change is different in India the way it's different for most developing countries, which is there's a very real human impact story that is wound into the story of climate change, i.e. it's not just a narrative around emissions or cutting emissions. It really is one around livelihoods. It's one around healthcare, about economic transition. So for instance, in India, if you talk about land use, you cannot just talk about hectares. You have to talk about population density. You have to talk about the communities that live within these forests, and not just about deforestation or forest cover, as it were. So you have to have that sort of dual lens, and what we refer to it as is co-benefits, or a co-benefits approach. So you have to look at the development priorities that you're aiming for, and you have to make sure that you're incorporating that impact on climate change and vice versa, how climate change is impacting those development priorities. So a good example I always give is, for instance, if you have an education program, but it's in a drought affected area, and the girls are not coming to school because they're going to fetch water, you don't necessarily have an education problem, you have a climate change problem. So how are you in making sure that you're integrating that lens within all of the work that you're doing? And that's the story for most developing countries, which have highly vulnerable populations to climate change. And it's definitely true for India. I think the second part of the question definitely was around how we built the ICC, or the structure, as it were.
The approach and which stakeholders were involved in building that approach.
Right. So the approach was very much a mindset that we would scale solution providers, not necessarily, we would not focus on scaling the solutions per se, but we really wanted to create a big enough tent so that we could invite everyone in, no matter where they were on their climate journey. And we wanted to be sure that we could move them up that ladder, so to speak, while helping them do what they were doing, but just to do it more sustainably and to incorporate climate change. In doing so, I think, speaking to what Nancy just said, we really had to lead from behind. So it began as an initiative that grew out of the Tata Trust, which is one of India's largest social philanthropic organizations, where I set up the sustainability portfolio. And then we had to ensure that it was really sort of, there was a sense of ownership that was felt across, the community that we were creating, and that it wasn't something that was simply held by the Tata Trust. And so in doing that, the structure was actually quite unique. We set up an organizing committee, or sort of an advisory committee, if you will, of the core founders. And we really grew that within the space of a year and a half. And so now we have over 20 members, both international philanthropies as well as Indian philanthropies, private and corporate, in India. And they all feel a sense of ownership and a sense of responsibility in creating the India Climate Collaborative. And for many of them, this is their first foray into climate change. In fact, I would say most of them have never had, do no work in climate change, have not implemented a lens in across their portfolios before. But in that way, we're sort of, together in that mission. And for them, the first step was joining the ICC, or coming on board to create the ICC. And now, hopefully, they're going to sort of build in those impacts as well as those programs into their portfolios. But they're using this as an opportunity to learn from each other and to create that sense of shared community and ownership around climate change in India.
So a very collaborative approach as well. That's fantastic to hear. Thank you for sharing a little bit about some of those mechanics of how it comes to be and how it comes to form. So we have time for just one more question. So I'd like to, before we wrap up with final thoughts, so this question is for you, Nancy. One of the questions is, what would be the parameters for ideal funding on climate initiatives?
Does that mean in terms of making a pledge? Is that the?
Yes, in terms of making a pledge, what would be the ideal parameters?
So we are really interested in creating a much bigger tent here around climate philanthropy. So there are not specific minimums, there's not specific requirements. As I tried to suggest, perhaps agnostic is not the best word, but we're neutral in terms of where people want to direct their climate philanthropy at this point around the pledge. As I said, through the CAP, we are focusing our conversations on deepening around food systems thinking and joining up actors in the food space. We're also focusing on the climate literacy communications and the investment side of things more specifically. But in terms of the pledge, this really is about signaling to the field. It is about getting more money out there. It's about encouraging new conversations. An easy way to start a new conversation with a donor that hasn't been involved to date in climate philanthropy. And it's encouraging all of us to look at the investment side of things as well, whether that's impact investing, whether it's our commercial investments. Regardless, we want to sort of embed climate change into our thinking, into our conversation, into our actions. And so there are not specific parameters applied to the pledge. As long as it's mitigation, adaptation, climate change, we are thrilled to have people participate and share that information with us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nancy. And that's a great way to close this. I wanted to make sure that we have a bit of space for we'll do a quick round, and just to build off what you're sharing, Nancy, how can participants in this session engage with each of your organizations or your companies to accelerate climate action? Is there sort of a takeaway for them to take that next step to learn a bit more, or perhaps even join efforts together with you? And so maybe, yeah, Marika, just one minute on that note and closing remarks, and we'll go through.
Yeah, creating circular economy for plastics is something that we want to do worldwide. Of course, it's going to look different in different countries depending on what the realities are on the ground in terms of infrastructure or legislation. And we're always looking for partners and individuals to collaborate with, big and small. So I very much invite anybody to contact me, and I'm happy to engage and looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marika. Shloka?
We'd love to have anyone who's interested in engaging on board. The ICC was built to sort of link India to the international community, and of course regionally to Asia as well. I mean, ABPN is one of our strongest partners, and the hope really is that what we're doing on the ground in India can be built out, as I said, to sort of have a global impact, as well as bring in best practices and knowledge from across the globe. So anyone who's seeking to work on the ground in India, do reach out. We'd love to help out in whatever way possible. This is definitely, Nancy said this in the beginning, and so has Marika, this is a climate emergency. We are not going to solve this problem, alone. And I think the economic decline due to the COVID-19 crisis has really presented, many countries, including India, with a rare glimpse of the magnitude of transformations that are going to be required in the coming decade to deal with this other looming threat, which is climate change. And so hopefully this is a message we can present to the world of how stronger climate actions could be successfully aligned with development imperatives and how important it is to work together.
Thank you, Shloka. And last but not least, Nancy, what any final next steps? I know you touched on a few of these, but just to round us out.
Yeah, so at the end of the session, ABPN will share out the announcement for the pledge with the link to the website, which is climate-pledge.org. But we at the CAP are also, as I said, it's about expanding and deepening the climate philanthropy and the conversation. So we are hosting a series of conversations that link to the pledge but are not specific to that. That really is taking a deeper look as we come out of COVID at, what are the opportunities for a reset? What are the opportunities for the philanthropic sector to help advance some of this positive change that we see, whether it's Build Back Better or we're looking at even Build Better Before as a new framing, ways to create change. So if people are interested in sort of engaging around those conversations, please, be in touch with us, and we'd love to continue to build out this larger tent of actors and activists.
Well, thank you all so much for being part of this panel. It's been really, truly a pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics, is the art and the science of collaboration and how we can work together more effectively. I was hearing a lot of agreement around the role that we can play to signal towards a better future, and play that role, as you're saying, Nancy, in terms of pulling the directions of how both funding and other resources can help shape the future that we want. And by working as a network, we can identify where those gaps are and start to fill those gaps. and build that common narrative. I think that was also a really inspiring way to pull this together. One of the ways we're doing that is through this session and on this platform, and I hope that those watching today are feeling inspired. There's a third of viewers here who hadn't yet joined a platform and were very interested in joining a collaborative or a network. So I hope there are some very tangible next steps and platforms and partners for you to explore. Please do reach out to Marika, Nancy, and Shloka on the AVPN connector, or reach out to AVPN to also seek out other partners who might be in your local ecosystem as well. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to Caroline to close us out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Shloka, Marika, Nancy, and Stephanie. It was a great session, and I think that we had over 250 people joining that session, and I'm hoping that we will see more collaboratives and networks that come out of that, and more people joining those networks. You can see that we have some final polls that we would ask you to complete so that we can understand how best to engage with you on climate action in the future. Whilst everyone is submitting their responses, I wanted to thank our sponsors, because the session was made possible with the kind support of our impact partner, the Sea Foundation, our lead partners, Chandler Foundation, Stockholm Environment Institute, Anita and Price Foundation, and our knowledge partner, WordCam. The link to the Climate Action Pledge that Nancy can be referred. So let me first of all thank you all for submitting the polls, and we've closed that now. This session, the link that Nancy referred to is the Climate Action Pledge, and it can be found in the resource section below. You can see where it says link sharing and Climate Action Pledge, and I would encourage everyone to click on the link and to read more about the pledge. It will also be available on the AVPN Climate Action platform that can be found on the website. To continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the AVPN connector. The link can also be found in the resource section. Do share your highlights of this session on social media, and remember to tag us with the hashtag AVPN2020. Our next session will be tomorrow morning. This is the last of the Climate Day sessions. We have tomorrow is Philanthropy Day. And our session will be, the first session will be at 8 a.m. Singapore time, Adapting to COVID-19, the Changing Face of Philanthropy. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good evening, or have a lovely day, and thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.